Yes, are you?
Yep, I'm doing well too, thank you. I have just started recording. Keep in mind, I think you can see whether I'm recording class or not. So if you ever notice that I'm not recording when we start, remind me. I forgot to record class on Monday. I do have all the recordings up on a YouTube channel now. So I'll explain how you can get there in a moment. But if you ever forget the instructions, or if you can't access your email, but you can access the class, I did put an announcement up on the class webpage. And it does have the Zoom ID that we're using for our meetings, and it also has the information about how to get to the recordings of our Zoom classes. And it's got my email on there. So just kind of contact information in general. And keep in mind, if worse comes to worse, and you can get to the South Suburban website, you can always go to the South Suburban website, and then you can go to, I think it's called Employee Directories. And I'm under faculty, of course, and you can go there and find my email or my telephone. Email definitely works best because I'm usually only on campus about 1 day a week. So are there any questions about what we discussed about speciation the other day, or anything else that we've talked about with evolution so far? Okay, if not, I'm going to go to screen sharing. And we're going to continue our discussion of macroevolution today, evolution that really goes beyond just changes to the gene pool. And we're going to look at a variety of things. And one of the considerations that we want to keep in mind is when we look at macroevolution, we almost always have to think about a branch of biology called paleontology. And paleontology studies fossils. The reason we usually have to think about paleontology, we'll see a few exceptions in a moment where we don't, is when we're looking at large patterns in evolution, typically these large patterns take hundreds, maybe thousands of years to develop. And that is if they're relatively quick. They may take millions of years to develop. So from that point of view, they're not something that we can necessarily see in species that are alive right here and right now. And if we can see them, we can kind of see traces of what have happened in the past, or we can see the beginning of something that'll be more prominent in the future. Well, this is a problem for biologists. After Darwin published his book in 1859, remember his book was, part of his title was On the Origin of Species. So how do we get new species? His idea in the book was mostly something called gradualism. And gradualism, the name is a pretty good description. The idea is gradualism is a very slow process, and it occurs over long periods of time. Remember, one of the things we said was that people who interpreted the Bible very literally, some of them thought that the world had been created in about 4000 BC. And if the world had actually been created in 4000 BC, that wouldn't have been enough time for evolution to occur, according to how Darwin saw it. Now, today we know that evolution can occur a little more quickly than Darwin thought, but at the same time, if the Earth was only about 6,000 years old, that still wouldn't work very well. The basic idea of gradualism, Darwin didn't phrase it exactly this way, because keep in mind, in Darwin's time, we didn't know about meiosis, we didn't know about DNA, we didn't know about alleles. But the basic idea of gradualism is that when we look at macroevolution, when we look at how one species might change into another species, or might split into two species. Remember, we talked about allopatric speciation the other day. When we look at that, basically macroevolution patterns are just microevolution. So changes in the gene pool. And they're changes in the gene pool that happen over a long period of time. They gradually accumulate. So imagine that humans, go through microevolution. There's some evidence that our little finger is gradually getting smaller and smaller. And eventually some people think our little finger may disappear. And there is some evidence that the brain is getting slightly larger if we look at the human lineage. So you can imagine there are a lot of changes. If you came back and you looked at humans in 1,000 years or 100,000 years or 1,000,000 years or 10 million years, you might see that humans weren't very much like they are today. And so you might say, instead of calling them Homo sapiens, we're going to give them a new name. They're so different. They're a completely different species. And this is the idea that macroevolution, forming new species, other patterns that we'll talk about later, are just changes in the gene pool that happen over a long time and gradually build up until we have a new population that's so different from the one that we started with that we don't think it's the same species anymore. We think it's different. Well, the problem with this arose as a paper that was published in 1972. There were two paleontologists, Niles Eldredge and Stephen Jay Gould, and they said, well, gradualism sounds nice, but here's the problem. When you study fossils, you very rarely see gradualism in the fossil record. Now, keep in mind, when we study fossils, there are some limitations. Fossils are only formed under certain conditions. So a lot of living organisms die and don't leave fossils behind. And when we look at fossils, hard parts of the body fossilize better than soft parts. So if we look at mammals, the group that we're in, for instance, we have a pretty good fossil record of mammal bones from the past. We don't have such a good record of mammal muscle tissue or mammal skin or mammal stomachs. We don't have as good a fossil record of soft body parts. But Eldredge and Gould said, when you look at what we can see, and they didn't study mammals, they basically studied animals like snails and clams, where we look at shell sizes and shell shapes. They said, this isn't what we see. They said, here's what we see when we look at organisms. Most organisms change very little over the time that they exist in the fossil record. And they said that this was a period of equilibrium. The organisms are at a balance with their environment. And they said when evolutionary change does occur, it's very rapid. And they called this punctuation, like the punctuation mark that stops a sentence. So their idea is called punctuated equilibrium. Now, if we think about this in terms of modern genetics, and they did talk about modern genetics, because keep in mind, this is 1972, so they knew about DNA, they knew Mendel's laws, they knew how meiosis works. This fits some of the ideas that we've been talking about. The idea that maybe you get a new species when you have a small population that separates from the main population. So remember, when we have populations split off, this is that idea that we talked about with allopatric speciation. And if we have a small population that splits off, then that idea that we talked about called genetic drift, that we said is important in small populations, genetic drift comes into play. So let's compare what we would see if we look at the fossil record. And we're going to see lots of diagrams like this, so we want to talk a little bit about what they mean. So on the x-axis of these graphs, we have morphology. And morphology is the technical name for what we sometimes call anatomy. So morphology has to do with body parts. So maybe we're measuring the width of a clamshell, or maybe we're measuring the length of the humerus, a bone that's found in the arm of mammals, or the foreleg, if we're talking about a mammal that walks on 4 legs rather than 2. So each red dot represents a fossil. And the y-axis is time. Now notice the oldest time is always down at the bottom, and the most recent time is up at the top. And this is because if we look at fossils, most fossils are found in layers of rock. And if you think about how rock is formed, think of it like a stack of papers on your desk. The paper you put down first ends up being on the bottom. The paper that you put down last ends up being on the top. So if we look at how fossils are deposited in layers of rock, the oldest fossils are deposited first. They're gradually covered by more mud and sand and limestone, different types of rock. And then newer fossils are deposited above them. So let's look at gradualism first, since this was the first idea that was proposed. So down towards the bottom of the graph of gradualism, a little bit over towards the left, we have some fossils. And notice that whatever we're looking at, the size of the shell, the length of the humerus, maybe the number of spines on a cactus, whatever it is, changes gradually. And when the population, the original population, splits into 2 subgroups, the 2 subgroups are pretty similar, and then they gradually get more and more different. Now, how can we tell they get more and more different? Because those 2 lines get farther and farther apart. And if they split again, the same thing happens. When we have one population that splits into 2, the 2 populations are very similar right after the split, and they gradually get more and more and more different over time. So this is gradualism. Today, we might look at these 4 types of fossils. Today, they might not be fossils, they might be alive, but we might look at that and see 4 different species. And so this is how gradualism says we would get those species. Now, if we look at punctuated equilibrium, the idea that Eldridge and Gould proposed, notice that if we look at the splits where one population splits into 2, this looks more like the goalposts on a football field. And this is because what Eldridge and Gould say is we have one population, it doesn't change very much. I think this line is really straight up, but realistically it ought to be at, maybe an 89-degree angle here or something. It ought to be slightly slanted, but not as slanted as this line. So as the population splits into 2 groups, these groups are smaller. So when the population splits, things like the founder effect and genetic drift are very important. So what the 2 populations end up looking like depends a lot on which organisms were in that founding population to begin with. So genetic drift can potentially change one population and make it different from another. So notice at the end, we still have 4 species. They're still separated by the same distance between one species and another, but how we got there is very different. For most of the time that it exists, a species is pretty much the same in terms of the size of its shell, the length of its humerus, whatever we're looking at. But then when there's a change, the change happens very quickly. Now, Eldridge and Gould say that's the reason that we don't have fossils, because the change happens really quickly in a small population. So remember what I said, when most organisms die, they don't leave fossils behind. So it's a small population. So they're not going to leave very many fossils. And because it's a small population, change is very rapid because of that founder effect. So both of the ideas here are supported by what we know about genetics nowadays. when Darwin was talking about gradualism, he didn't know about genetics, but it turns out that, gradualism really reflects changes in the gene pool, microevolution. So the idea of gradualism is macroevolution is just microevolution for a long time. The idea of punctuated equilibrium is it's not just microevolution for a long time. It's still microevolution, but it's microevolution in very small populations, so it happens very quickly. Now, keep in mind, when we say that it happens very quickly, our best estimate is that the Earth is about 4.6 billion years old. So 4.6 billion years. So when we say that punctuated equilibrium might happen quickly, we might be talking about 2,000 or 3,000 years or 20,000 years. But keep in mind, if we think about the Earth being 4.6 billion years old, if this process took 4.6 thousand years, that's only 1/1,000,000th of the time the Earth has been in existence. So when we say things are quick or slow, when we're talking about macroevolution, we want to keep in mind that we're talking about geological time scales. So things that happen slowly are usually happening in millions of years. Things that are happening quickly might be happening in 900 years or 5,000 years, but that's still pretty quick in terms of the overall history of the Earth. So we want to keep in mind exactly what we're thinking of when we say that punctuated equilibrium is faster. So right now, most biologists agree that neither one of these ideas is completely right. Some groups of living organisms have probably evolved by gradualism. Notice this graph is called phyletic gradualism. Phyletic just refers to a group of organisms. Punctuated equilibrium is probably right some of the time. So it depends what type of organisms we're looking at. So probably one of them is not right all the time and the other is wrong all the time. It's probably a mix. But we want to keep these kind of two different patterns in mind, because depending on what type of organism we're looking at, we may see more of one pattern, we may see more of another pattern. Now let's think about some other patterns that we see in macroevolution. And keep in mind, when we talk about macroevolution, we're generally talking about patterns that include more than one species. So speciation is macroevolution because we have one species separating into two groups and forming two species. So speciation was what we talked about the other day. But in some cases, we see patterns in macroevolution that don't always make a new species. One pattern that we see pretty commonly is something called coevolution. Now, when we talk about coevolution, co always means with. So coevolution is when we have two species, or we could have more than two in some cases. And these two species really interact with each other strongly. And they interact with each other so strongly that the evolution of each species reciprocally affects the other. So that means that the evolution of species A has a strong influence on the evolution of species B. And the evolution of species B has a strong influence on the evolution of species A. So what are some of the things that we see that show coevolution? Well, one is flowering plants and their pollinators. Pollinators are the things, animals, that transfer pollen from one plant to another plant. Now, keep in mind, as far as plants are concerned, plants do make eggs. Pollen is their equivalent of sperm. So, we've all heard about bees pollinating plants. We often see coevolution between predators and prey. If we look at mammals, the organisms that we're related to, what we see is that most prey organisms have evolved to become faster runners to escape their predators. most predators have evolved to have bigger brains so that they can outsmart the prey. We see coevolution when we have species that mimic other species, that look like other species. We see coevolution between hosts and their parasites, and in other types of interactions as well. So let's look at a few examples of this. So let's look at this. If you look at this kind of red and yellow might look like it's the head of something like an insect with an antenna. This is actually part of a flower. This is called a laughing bumblebee orchid. And believe it or not, there are some bees that resemble this brightly colored part of the orchid. Now, remember, we talked about the idea that females tend to invest more heavily in offspring than males do. And because of this, there's usually some sort of competition. Males' goal is typically to fertilize as many eggs as they can. Remember, the ultimate goal of living things is to reproduce, which means to pass down your DNA. Well, for a male, the easiest way to do that, since males don't invest very much in their sperm cells, is mate with as many females as you can. So this flower looks like a female laughing bumblebee. That's where the orchid gets its name. So what happens? Well, male laughing bumblebees are flying around. They land on this flower. They try to mate with it. And while they're trying to mate with it, they pick up some pollen. And then after a while, they get bored. You know, this female is not being very responsive, apparently. And the male takes off, flies around. He sees another orchid. He lands on it. And when he tries to mate, he transfers some pollen. Now, keep in mind what we said about females being choosier about who they mate with. We haven't discovered any flowers that look like males of a species that entice the females to try to land and mate. But there are several types of flowers that look like females, and the males land, try to mate, pick up pollen, and transfer it to another flower. And when we talk about plants later, we'll discuss this more, but notice that's one reason why when a certain type of plant produces flowers, they all flower around the same time. If all the laughing bumblebee flowers are flowering at the same time, then it's more likely that the pollinators transfer pollen to another laughing bumblebee orchid instead of a different plant. That doesn't do the orchids any good if they transfer the pollen to a rose or something else. So we see this with several different types of plants. Now, there are several different types of mimicry. One type of mimicry is something called Batesian mimicry. And in Batesian mimicry, we have a harmless species, and the harmless species evolves to mimic the warning coloration on a poisonous species or a noxious species. A noxious species isn't poisonous, it just tastes really bad. Now, when we look in nature, most species that are noxious or poisonous are brightly colored. And the reason they're brightly colored is most predators are smart enough. They can figure out that if something is poisonous or tastes really horrible, they don't want to mess with it. So something that is noxious or poisonous wants to stand out from the environment. It wants to warn all the potential predators, stay away from me. Things that aren't poisonous a lot of times are kind of green or brown. They tend to blend in with their environment. They don't want to be noticed because predators could eat them. So in the southeastern United States, Florida and a little bit further from Florida, there are two types of snakes that look kind of similar. There's something called the eastern coral snake, and the eastern coral snake is venomous. It's very poisonous. And there are other snakes in the area that belong to a different species. They're scarlet king snakes. Scarlet I'm tongue twisted this morning. Scarlet king snakes are not poisonous. But if you look at coral snakes, they have black and yellow and red stripes. Scarlet king snakes have black and yellow and red stripes. So what are they trying to do? Well, predators are smart enough, they leave eastern coral snakes alone. So scarlet king snakes are basically trying to freeload and kind of ride along with the eastern coral snakes because predators see yellow, black, red, they avoid them. Now notice it's not the exact same pattern. If we look at the black here, notice the black is between two yellow bands. If we look at the black here, the black has the yellow between it. So, you know, if you go out in kind of the wooded areas in the southeastern United States, there's a saying, black and yellow kills a fellow. Red and black's a friend to Jack, because black and yellow bands together, that's a poisonous snake. Red and black bands together, that's not poisonous, that's harmless. And we see lots of examples of this. So, you know, what happens? The scarlet king snake, essentially, predators leave it alone more often than they would if it didn't resemble the eastern coral snake. Keep in mind, most predators, as I say, are pretty smart. They might make one mistake, but they don't make very many mistakes when they try to eat animals that are poisonous or just bad tasting. They usually will avoid it in the future if it doesn't kill them the first time. There's another type of mimicry called Mullerian mimicry. And in Mullerian mimicry, we have multiple poisonous or noxious species, and they evolve to resemble each other. So an example of this is some butterflies that are found in this part of the country, in fact, viceroy butterflies and monarch butterflies. Notice that they both have wings that are mostly kind of an orangish color. They have a black trim with white dots around the edges. And both of these are poisonous. Monarch butterflies contain something called a cardiac glycoside that can give vertebrates, things that have a backbone, can give vertebrates a heart attack. So sometimes birds, because birds prey on a lot of insects, birds will eat a little bit of a monarch butterfly and they'll have a mild heart attack. And after that, they leave orange and black butterflies alone. Viceroys don't have cardiac glycosides, but they do have some other chemicals that are very mildly poisonous, but that are really bad tasting. So now what advantage in this case, since both species are things that predators are going to avoid, the advantage is a predator that tries to eat a viceroy. In the future, that predator is going to avoid viceroy butterflies, but it's also going to avoid monarchs. They look close enough, it's not going to take a chance. And a predator that eats part of a monarch, in the future, it's not only going to avoid monarch butterflies, it's going to avoid viceroy butterflies. So in this case, both species benefit. Notice if we go back to Batesian mimicry, the coral snake doesn't really benefit from this because the scarlet king snake isn't poisonous or noxious. So if a predator tries to eat it, the predator won't have any problems. I mean, it may have some problems subduing the snake, but it's not going to get sick. It's not going to be poisoned. So from that point of view, in this case, the scarlet king snake actually decreases the survival of coral snakes, because some predators might eat a scarlet king snake, nothing happens to them, so they think it's fine. So now the next time they might eat a eastern coral snake. And notice that although predators are smart, in this case, even though to our eye, the two snakes might not look that close, to things like birds, which are some of the main predators that eat snakes, this is close enough. Another pattern that we see in coevolution is something called convergent evolution. And in convergent evolution, we have species that aren't real closely related to each other, but they evolve similar characteristics. And some good examples of this are three types of organisms called ichthyosaurs and dolphins and sharks. If we look at ichthyosaurs and dolphins and sharks, and we look at their front fins all contain a similar pattern of bones. Keep in mind, ichthyosaurs are reptiles, sharks are fish, dolphins are mammals, but fish, reptiles, mammals are all vertebrates. So they all have a skeleton, and the skeleton is very similar in all of them. You know, if we look here, we have a diagram just of the ichthyosaur and the dolphin, but if you look, you can see that the overall body shape is similar. And there are other factors as well that resemble each other. Now, why should things that aren't very closely related end up resembling each other? Well, because if we look at these organisms, they all survive the same way in the same type of environment. They're all aquatic animals, which means they live in water. They're all marine, which means they live mostly in salt water. They're all predators, and they all live in open water. So they live in a similar environment. They all get their food the same way by eating smaller organisms in that environment. And as a result, they've all evolved some similar characteristics. We see this a lot with another group. If we look at mammals, the group that we're classified in, there are three different groups of mammals. Humans and most of the other mammals that we're familiar with are classified in a group called placentals. And placental mammals, the embryo develops attached to a placenta in the mother's body. Does anybody know what either of the other two groups of mammals are called? There are two other big groups of mammals. One of them is something you probably heard of, a group called the marsupials. And if we compare marsupials and placental mammals, there's a marsupial mole and there's a placental mole. And both moles look very similar. And both moles live underground. They crawl around. They're pretty much blind because they live underground. There's no light. Their front legs are adapted for digging tunnels. There are marsupials that resemble bats. There are marsupials that resemble wolves. So there's convergent evolution, even though marsupials evolved primarily on the continent of Australia when it was separated from the rest of the world. So if we look at these marsupials, all of them have something in common. Their young attached to a placenta, the same as placental mammals, but their young only complete about a third of the development attached to the placenta. The last 2/3, the baby actually, when a marsupial is born, when the baby comes out of the mother's vagina, it crawls into the pouch. And inside the pouch is a nipple. And it attaches to the nipple and it suckles. And then that's how it grows and completes kind of the last 2/3 of its development. But if we look at some of the characteristics that marsupial moles and placental moles have, some of the characteristics are very similar. Now, we talked about the layers of rock that we might find. And to study the last two patterns that we want to talk about, we have to think about something called the geologic timescale. And so if we look at the geologic timescale, the geologic timescale is divided into three main eras, and a fourth we'll talk about. The Cenozoic, and Ceno means recent or modern. So, and zo, like zoology, this is the era, the age of modern animals. And then the Mesozoic, meso means middle. This is the middle age of animals. And the Paleozoic. And the Paleozoic, paleo is old, is the age of the old animals. Now notice that eras are divided into periods, and periods can be divided into epochs and ages. So the oldest time frame is on the bottom. So starting with the formation of Earth, we have something called the Precambrian. Notice the Cambrian is the first period up here in the Paleozoic era. So the Precambrian, pre means before. So there are three, they're called eons in this case. The first one right after the formation of the Earth is called the Hadean eon. So think of Hades, hell. So at this point, the Earth was very hot. The atmosphere probably contained a lot of ammonia, hydrogen, nitrogen, things that we don't really find much of in the atmosphere anymore. As the Earth began to cool, we have the Achaean eon, and we have some evidence that there were photosynthesizing bacteria at this time. They're called cyanobacteria. And then we have the Proterozoic. Proter means beginning, and again, that zoic refers to animals. So this is the first animals that we start to see. And not just the first animals, but the first multicellular organisms. And some people think it's around this time. This is 570 million years ago. Notice that's what MYA stands for, a million years ago. Remember a moment ago, I said the early atmosphere of the Earth had methane in it, it had ammonia in it, it had hydrogen, and this is really the first time that we see oxygen in the atmosphere at present levels. I'm going to have to stop class now because I have a call back from the state of Illinois. Let me see. Hello? I'm on the phone. You can talk to her. I picked it up too. Okay, I'm gonna hang up my part now. Okay, it's all right. They're talking to my wife. I'm gonna stay here. Okay, so what we see is that if we look at these periods in general, the Cenozoic era is sometimes called the age of mammals. The Mesozoic is sometimes called the age of reptiles. So in terms of the dominant living organisms that were there.
Dr. Griffith, your screen share isn't on.
Oh, it's not? Okay, let's go back. Okay, I am going to have to cancel class.
No, I just need your.
I am going to have to cancel class.
Okay, he said.
So I'm going to stop class now and we'll pick up tomorrow. I'm sorry.